Real women don't care if their men party with his female secretary. My husband threw those words out like a cheap punchline during our 10-year anniversary dinner. The room went silent, but I did not shatter. I simply smiled, watching him bask in his own arrogance. He has no idea that those 11 words just ended our marriage and started a countdown he will never see coming. My name is Lauren Whitaker. At 38 years old, I have learned that the Atlantic breeze in Bay Ridge, North Carolina, carries a specific kind of salt that clings to your skin long after you have retreated into the air conditioning. Tonight, that salt felt like a thin layer of resin holding my face in a mask of perfect composure. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the private dining suite of the Gilded Anchor, smoothing the fabric of a navy silk dress that cost more than my first car. It was our 10-year wedding anniversary. 10 years of building a life that I chose to call stable, even when the foundations felt like they were made of coastal silt. I have spent a decade becoming the quiet background music to Daniel Whitaker's life. He is a middle manager at Silver Row Dynamics, a private media firm where the hours are long and the office culture is even longer. For years, I told myself that his late nights and frequent after-work drinks were just part of the professional ladder. I ignored the scent of expensive perfume that clung to his wool coats, a scent that was definitely not my signature citrus blend. He spent his nights at rooftop bars with colleagues, usually centered around a young, 20-something secretary whose name I had intentionally scrubbed from my memory to keep my sanity intact. Lauren, you look beautiful, but you are miles away. A voice broke through my thoughts. It was Megan Price, my best friend and a civil lawyer who had seen enough messy divorces to recognize the hollow look in a woman's eyes before the woman realized it herself. She stood by the door, her arms crossed over a tailored blazer. I am just thinking about the seating chart. Megan, I replied, forcing a smile that felt tight across my cheekbones. Megan stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. Lauren, please. We talked about this. The credit card statements from those hotels, the late-night texts. You cannot keep pretending this is just business as usual for Silver Row. I turned back to the mirror, adjusting a pearl earring with hands that were almost steady. It is our 10-year anniversary. Megan. Both our families are in the next room. My parents flew in from Charlotte. His mother spent 3 hours at the salon. We are a stable couple. We are fine. Stable is just another word for stagnant if you are the only one holding the weight, Megan said, her eyes filled with a pity that I was not ready to accept. The party began with a deceptive warmth. The room was filled with the clinking of crystal and the low hum of family gossip. My mother was laughing with Daniel's father about a cruise they wanted to take next spring. My father was discussing real estate trends with an uncle. Everything looked perfect. It was a scene from a magazine, a testament to a decade of successful partnership. But as the clock ticked past 7:30, then 7:45, the seat at the head of the table remained conspicuously empty. I sipped my Chardonnay, the acidity sharp against my tongue. My mother leaned over, her voice laced with concern. Where is he, honey? It is nearly 8 o'clock. He had a late meeting at the firm, I said, the lie sliding out of my mouth with practiced clinical ease. He will be here any minute. When the heavy oak doors finally swung open at 8:15, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Daniel did not enter the room. He invaded it. He did not look like a man who had just come from a grueling board meeting. His tie was loosened, his hair was slightly disheveled, and the smell of bourbon arrived several seconds before he did. He looked around the room with a glassiness in his eyes that spoke of at least 3 drinks consumed in a hurry. Sorry I am late, everyone, Daniel announced, his voice booming with an unearned, drunken confidence. He did not look at me. He walked straight to the bar in the corner. The office was much more fun than a commute in the rain. He laughed, a loud, jagged sound that grated against the sophisticated jazz playing in the background. He leaned heavily against the back of his chair, looking down at the meticulously plated appetizers as if they were a personal insult. "Daniel," his mother whispered, her face flushing with deep embarrassment. "Sit down. Lauren has been waiting." He waved a dismissive hand, finally turning his gaze toward me. His eyes were cold, stripped of the affection they used to hold in our early years. He looked at me not as his partner of 10 years, but as a dull obligation he had to endure. "Lauren is fine," he said, his voice dripping with an arrogance that made the air in the room feel thin. She is always so patient, aren't you, dear? Like a good little lighthouse waiting for the ship to come home." He pulled out his chair, the screech of wood against the floor sounding like a physical blow to the silence of the room. He sat down and reached for my wine glass. Draining it in one aggressive gulp, I sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling the eyes of our parents and Megan burning into me. The stability I had fought so hard to maintain was beginning to shatter, and for the first time in 10 years, I did not reach out to catch the pieces. The main course arrived, a seared sea bass that looked exquisite and tasted like ash in my mouth. Daniel swirled his third glass of whiskey, the ice cubes clinking like a funeral bell against the crystal. He had been rambling about a successful campaign at Silver Road Dynamics for 10 minutes, barely stopping to breathe. My father tried to pivot the conversation to the weather, but Daniel was not interested in small talk. He was interested in an audience. "You know what the problem is with most marriages these days," Daniel said, leaning across the white linen tablecloth. He did not lower his voice. In fact, he projected it toward the neighboring table where a group of local businessmen sat. "Men are expected to be monks, but the world does not work like that. My secretary, she understands. She is 24, sharp, and she knows that business happens after midnight at the club." He looked at me, a cruel smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Real women don't care if their men party with his female secretary," he declared, his voice ringing through the silent dining room. "They understand that a man needs a certain kind of energy to stay on top of his game." The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me cold in the heated room. Across the table, my mother's fork clattered against her porcelain plate with a sharp, jarring ring. Daniel's father stared intently at his napkin, his jaw set in a hard, rigid line. No one moved. No one spoke. The festive atmosphere of our 10-year anniversary had been sucked out of the room, replaced by a thick, ugly tension. Daniel let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Look at all of you. So old-fashioned. It is just honesty. Isn't it manly honesty?" He turned his attention back to me, his eyes squinting as if he were trying to bring a blurry image into focus. "What is that look for, Lauren? Are you going to give me that disappointed schoolteacher face again? This is the problem. You are just not modern enough. You are trapped in some 1950s mindset while I am out there actually living in the real world." I did not say a word. I sat perfectly still, my spine pressed against the velvet back of my chair. I realized then that this was a performance. This was not just a drunken outburst or a slip of the tongue. He had been doing this for years, subtly chipping away at my dignity in front of our friends, our neighbors, and now, our family. Every joke about my lack of ambition, every comment about how I was too sensitive for the fast-paced world of media, it was all leading to this moment of public humiliation. He was testing the fences, seeing exactly how much of his poison I would swallow before I choked. "I think you have had enough to drink, Daniel," my father said, his voice low and dangerous, the sound of a man who had reached his limit. "Oh, come on, Bill," Daniel scoffed, waving a hand dismissively as if my father were a bothersome fly. "Lauren knows I am right. She is just being too sensitive. As usual, A little drama for the 10-year anniversary. Right. It keeps things interesting. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Megan. She was not looking at Daniel. She was looking at me, her face a mask of cold, legal fury. Underneath the edge of the tablecloth, I saw her hand move with calculated precision. She slid her smartphone out of her clutch. The screen dimmed to the lowest setting to remain unnoticed. I watched her thumb press the red record button. She caught my eye for a split second, a silent, heavy question in her gaze. I gave a microscopic nod, a signal that the truce was over. As Daniel continued to drone on about how modern couples give each other space and how I lacked the spark of his younger colleagues, I stopped hearing his words. Instead, I started seeing the patterns. I remembered the nights he came home at 3 a.m, smelling of expensive gin and a floral scent that was not mine. I remembered the business trips to Miami that never seemed to produce any new clients but always resulted in maxed-out credit cards. I remembered the way he had slowly moved our joint savings into accounts I could not easily access, claiming it was for tax efficiency. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place with a sickening, mechanical precision. He was not just cheating, he was gaslighting me into believing that my discomfort was a personal failure of character. He wanted me to be the real woman who stood by and smiled while he lived a double life. Lauren Daniel leaned closer, his breath hot and smelling of stale alcohol and entitlement. Are you even listening, or are you going to cry now? Is that the next part of the show? I looked him directly in the eyes. I did not cry. I did not scream. I felt a strange, icy calm wash over me, the kind of calm that comes when you finally realize the house is on fire and you are the only one with the key to the exit. I am listening. Daniel, I said, my voice steady and clear, cutting through his drunken haze. I am listening very carefully. He seemed momentarily thrown by my lack of reaction. He blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing his arrogant face, before he turned back to the table to pour himself another drink. He thought he had won. He thought he had broken me down to a point where I would simply accept his terms to avoid further embarrassment in front of our parents. He had no idea that Megan was capturing every poisonous word, and he had no idea that I was already mentally dismantling every brick of the life we had built together. I looked at the wine stain on the white cloth, a jagged red shape that resembled a map of a country I no longer recognized. 10 years. For 3,650 days, I had convinced myself that this was what a successful marriage looked like. I had worked so hard to build my career at the Harbor Insight Institute, pouring my heart into nonprofit research that actually meant something to the coastal communities of North Carolina. I remember the afternoon 5 years ago when I came home, buzzing with excitement because we had finally secured a $200,000 grant for the wetland restoration project. Daniel had barely looked up from his phone. That is nice. Lauren, he had said, his voice flat with boredom. It is a lot of work for a little bit of charity money, isn't it? I just don't understand why you spend 40 hours a week on a time-consuming hobby when you could be doing something that actually generates a real profit. He had called it a hobby. My life's work, my master's degree, the hundreds of pages of data I had meticulously analyzed, all reduced to a distraction that kept me out of his way. The memories began to bleed into the present moment at the restaurant. I looked at him, really looked at him, as he leaned back and smirked at his own cleverness. He had spent years conditioning me. It was a slow, methodical training process. Every time I questioned a late-night return at 2 a.m, he would turn it back on me. He would use that weary, condescending tone that made me feel like an irrational child. It was a client dinner. Lauren, I am out there making sure we can afford this house, this car, this life, he would say. If you were more involved in the corporate world, you would understand. But you stay in your little nonprofit bubble, so I suppose I shouldn't expect you to get it. He used those pauses, those heavy silences filled with unspoken insults, to make me doubt my own intuition. I remembered the night 6 months ago when I found a receipt for a jewelry store in his pocket. It was for a diamond bracelet that cost $4,000. I never saw that bracelet. When I asked him about it, his face had contorted into a mask of feigned hurt. It was for a top-tier client's wife, Lauren. He had snapped, Are you really going to interrogate me over a business expense? Do you have so little faith in me after all these years?" I had backed down. I had apologized. I had ignored the sinking feeling in my chest because I wanted to keep the peace. I wanted to keep the family together for our parents, for the neighbors, for the image of the Whitakers of Bay Ridge. I had been trained to accept the crumbs of his attention and the weight of his disrespect. I had been socialized to believe that a good wife was one who absorbed the blows to her ego without making a sound. But as the clinking of silverware continued around me, something inside me finally went cold. The woman who would have apologized for his behavior tonight, the woman who would have pulled him aside and begged him to stop drinking for the sake of her dignity. She was gone. I felt her leave the room. "Are you okay?" Lauren, my mother, whispered, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for mine. I looked at her, seeing the fear in her eyes, the same fear I had lived with for a decade. I gave her hand a firm, reassuring squeeze. I am perfectly fine, Mom," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. In fact, I have never felt more awake. Daniel did not notice. He was too busy telling a story about a high-stakes meeting at Silver Row Dynamics, his hands gesturing wildly in the air. He expected me to be the same Lauren he had spent 10 years molding. He expected me to be the quiet, hurt wife who would cry in the car on the way home and then forgive him by breakfast. He expected me to be predictable. He was wrong. Every insult he had hurled tonight was a brick in a wall I was building between us. I was no longer interested in saving the marriage. I was interested in surviving it. I watched him, recording the tilt of his head, the arrogance in his eyes, the way he dismissed everyone else at the table. He thought he was the hunter in this room, but he was merely a man walking blindly into a storm he had helped create. I would not scream. I would not shout. I would simply wait for the right moment to let the tide pull him under. I stood up from the table with a grace I did not know I possessed, my chair making a soft, muffled sound against the thick carpet. I felt the weight of every gaze in the room, my mother's tearful eyes, my father's clenched jaw, and Megan's calculated stare. Daniel did not even look up. He was busy spearheading a piece of sea bass, his movements jerky and filled with the misplaced confidence of the very drunk and the very arrogant. "Excuse me for a moment," I said, my voice as cool as the ocean breeze outside. "I need to freshen up." The restroom was a sanctuary of white marble, polished chrome, and silence. I walked to the farthest stall, locked the door, and leaned my head against the cold partition. My heart was thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were no longer shaking. I pulled my phone from my clutch, the screen glowing brightly in the dim light. I had seen a notification chime just as Daniel began his tirade about real women, a digital whisper that I had ignored until now. It was an email from Eleanor Whitaker. Eleanor was not just a relative by marriage. She was the senior partner at a prestigious firm in Raleigh and the executor of my late Aunt Sarah's estate. Aunt Sarah had been a recluse, a woman who lived in a sprawling Victorian house in Asheville and spent her days painting landscapes that she refused to sell. We had been close in a quiet, unspoken way, sharing a love for the coast and a disdain for pretension. I tapped the message open. "Dear Lauren," the email began. "I am writing to confirm that the final audits for the Sarah Bennett Revocable Trust have been completed. As of this morning, the transfer of assets into your name is ready for execution. The total value of the trust, including the real estate holdings and the diversified investment portfolio, stands at approximately $35,400,000. I stopped breathing. $35 million. I stared at the words until they blurred into shimmering lines of light. I knew Aunt Sarah had been comfortable, but I had never imagined this. The email continued, and my eyes locked onto a paragraph highlighted in a slightly different font. Please be advised of the specific stipulation in Section 9, Clause B, as per your aunt's explicit instructions. These assets are to be classified as sole and separate property, protected from any marital claims, provided that at the time of the final disbursement, the beneficiary has initiated a legal separation or is involved in a no-fault divorce proceeding. If the marriage is intact and uncontested at the time of distribution, the funds will remain in a restricted holding for another 5 years. A cold, sharp realization pierced through the shock. My mind raced back to 2 weeks ago. I had walked into Daniel's home office to bring him a cup of coffee, and he had slammed his laptop shut with suspicious haste. Later that night, while he was in the shower, I saw a stray tab on his tablet. He had been searching for North Carolina equitable distribution laws and how to protect corporate bonuses during a divorce. He did not know about the $35 million. He thought he was the one with everything to lose. He thought he was the high-powered manager at Silver Row Dynamics who was tethered to a penniless nonprofit researcher. He was researching how to dump me and keep his precious 401k and his year-end bonuses. The insult at the table, the comment about real women and secretaries, it was not just drunken honesty. It was a provocation. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to throw a glass of wine at him. He wanted me to act like the unstable, sensitive woman he had spent years telling everyone I was. He was trying to build a case, to create a narrative where I was the problem, so he could walk away with his dignity and his bank account intact. He was trying to force my hand, never realizing that by doing so, he was handing me the key to a fortune he could never touch. Oh, Daniel, you have no idea what you just did, I whispered to the empty room. I felt a surge of power so intense it was almost dizzying. For 10 years, I had been the one who compromised, the one who stayed quiet, the one who lived in the shadow of his ego. I had been the one worried about the cost of a new car or whether we could afford to renovate the kitchen, and all the while, he had been looking for the exit, thinking I would be left with nothing but my master's degree and a broken heart. I stood in front of the mirror and washed my hands. I watched the water swirl down the drain, imagining it was the last 10 years of my life. I adjusted my hair, smoothed my silk dress, and applied a fresh coat of lipstick. My reflection looked back at me not as a victim of a public humiliation, but as a woman who had just inherited a kingdom. I tucked my phone back into my bag. The anger was gone, replaced by a clinical, predatory focus. I was not going to give him the satisfaction of a scene. I was not going to cry. I was going to walk back out there, sit down, and play the part of the modern, understanding wife for just a little while longer. I was going to let him believe he was winning, right up until the moment the floor fell out from under him. I opened the restroom door and stepped back into the hallway. The sound of the restaurant surged around me, but I felt insulated, as if I were moving through a world that no longer had the power to hurt me. I walked back to the private dining room, my head held high, a small, secret smile playing on my lips. The game had changed, and for the first time in a decade, I was the one holding all the cards. I reached the table and slid back into my seat. Daniel looked at me, his eyes glassy and filled with a smug, expectant cruelty. "Feeling better, Lauren?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Or was the truth a little too much for you to stomach?" I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. I looked him straight in the eyes, my gaze unwavering. "I feel wonderful, Daniel," I said, my voice sweet and dangerous. "I think I finally understand exactly where we stand." The silence at the table was brittle, like a sheet of ice waiting for the first heavy footstep to break it. My parents looked down at their plates, the silver forks clicking against the china in a rhythmic, nervous cadence. Daniel's mother was dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a linen napkin, while his father stared intensely at the far wall, his face flushed with a mixture of shame and irritation. Daniel himself was leaning back, a triumphant, ugly smirk still plastered across his face. He was waiting for me to snap. He was waiting for the tears, the accusations, the frantic defense of my womanhood that would prove him right. Instead, I reached for my champagne flute. The bubbles rose in a steady, golden stream, shimmering under the crystal chandelier. I stood up slowly, my movements fluid and deliberate. The room went even quieter, if that was possible. I felt Megan's eyes on me sharp, observant, and suddenly filled with a dawning comprehension. She saw the change in my posture. She saw the ice in my eyes that had replaced the fog of hurt. "I would like to propose a toast," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. It was not the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a woman who had just seen the exit sign in a burning building. Daniel blinked, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second. A toast. Well, that is certainly a choice. Lauren. I ignored the mockery in his tone and looked around at our guests. We are here to celebrate 10 years, a decade of what I thought was a shared vision. But tonight, Daniel has given me a gift far more valuable than any piece of jewelry or a fancy dinner. He has given me the gift of absolute, unfiltered honesty. I turned my gaze to him, holding it until he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Daniel, I want to thank you," I continued, my voice dripping with a sweetness that felt like a razor blade. "Thank you for being brave enough to say out loud what you have been feeling for so long. Most men would hide behind lies and excuses. But you had the courage to tell me, and our families, exactly how little you value our traditional ideas of loyalty. You told me that a real woman should be indifferent to her husband's indiscretions. It is a fascinating perspective. Lauren, I was just talking about the modern world," Daniel stammered, his face turning a deeper shade of red. He wasn't smirking anymore. He was looking around the room, realizing that his audience wasn't laughing with him. They were looking at him with a profound sense of disgust. "And I appreciate that education," I said, nodding gently. "Truly." "Because of your honesty. I realized something tonight that I have been too blind to see for a long time. If you believe that a real woman is someone who accepts being secondary to your secretary and your ego, then I have to admit, I am clearly not that woman." A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the room. My mother looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and pride. "So, to Daniel," I said, raising my glass higher, "for finally showing me exactly who he is, so I can finally decide exactly who I want to be. Happy 10-year anniversary, Daniel. It is certainly one for the record books." I took a sip of the champagne and sat back down. I didn't look at the guests. I didn't look at the ruined dinner. I looked at Daniel, whose mouth was hanging open slightly. He looked like a man who had tried to throw a punch only to find his target had turned into smoke. He was confused, his drunken brain struggling to process why I wasn't screaming at him. "What is that supposed to mean?" he muttered, his voice cracking. "You are making a scene. Lauren, you are being dramatic." "No, Daniel," I replied, my voice a calm, steady anchor in the room. "I am being modern. I am being clear. I think it is best if we take some time. I need some time to think about this marriage, and I think you need some time to spend with your energetic colleagues." Megan leaned back, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. The recording was finished, the evidence was secured, and the woman she had been trying to wake up for years was finally standing in front of her. The rest of the evening was a blur of forced, polite exits and heavy, suffocating silence. Our parents left first, offering hurried, awkward apologies as they practically ran for the door. Daniel tried to follow them, trying to spin a narrative that I was just overreacting to a few drinks, but my father simply turned his back on him. When the room was finally empty, save for the two of us and the waitstaff clearing the plates, the air felt thick enough to choke on. There were no more words. There was no shouting match. I simply stood up, grabbed my clutch, and walked toward the door. "Lauren, where are you? Where are you going?" Daniel called out, his voice sounding small and pathetic in the large, hollow room. I didn't turn around. "I'm going to get some sleep." "Daniel, I have a lot of work to do tomorrow." I walked out of the Gilded Anchor and into the cool Bay Ridge night, the scent of the ocean finally feeling clean again. The party was over, but my work was only just beginning. I had 35 million reasons to be patient, and only one reason to never look back. The morning after the anniversary dinner arrived with a cruel, indifferent brightness. Daniel was still asleep, his breathing heavy and smelling of the expensive bourbon he had used as a weapon the night before. I did not wake him. I did not offer him coffee or an aspirin. Instead, I sat in his home office, the light from his dual monitors reflecting in my eyes as I began the meticulous task of dismantling the man I had spent 10 years protecting. I knew his passwords. He had always been too arrogant to change them, believing that I lacked the interest or the intellect to ever look. I started with the Silver Row Dynamics expense reports. It took me less than 2 hours to find what I was looking for. There were receipts for $500 dinners at boutique restaurants in Charlotte, all categorized as client outreach. On nights when he had told me he was working late on a media buy, there were flight stubs for a weekend in Charleston for two, tucked away in a digital folder labeled Project Alpha. The most damning evidence was an invoice for a luxury hotel suite in downtown Raleigh, booked on my birthday last year. While I was sitting home alone with a cold pizza, I spent the next 3 days in a state of hyper-focused clarity. I was a researcher by trade. I knew how to find the needles in the haystacks. I moved through our shared accounts, tracing the flow of money like a scientist tracking a virus. That was when I found it. Over the last 4 months, Daniel had been systematically transferring 10% of our joint savings every few weeks into a private account I had never seen before. He was building a nest egg for his exit, making sure that when he finally decided I was too sensitive for his modern life, he would leave me with as little as possible. I met Megan at a quiet cafe 30 miles outside of Bay Ridge, far from any prying eyes. I laid the printed bank statements and the photographs of his emails on the table between us. "He is moving the money." "Megan," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He thinks he is being clever. He thinks I am just the quiet wife who is too busy with her nonprofit hobbies to notice the disappearing zeros." Megan looked over the documents, her professional mask slipping for a moment to reveal a flash of pure, concentrated fury. "This is more than just an affair. Lauren, this is financial fraud against the marital estate. If we play this right, if we can prove he was intentionally depleting your shared assets before a filing, he is going to lose everything." She paused, leaning forward. "But you have to stay the course. If he suspects you know about the money or the legal moves, he will bury the rest of the accounts. You have to be the woman he thinks you are. Can you do that? I have been doing it for 10 years. "Megan," I replied, "I can do it for a few more weeks." The following week was a masterclass in deception. I cooked dinner. I asked him how things were going at Silver Row Dynamics. I even laughed when he made a condescending joke about the Harbor Insight Institute. I watched him relax, his shoulders losing their tension as he convinced himself that my toast at the anniversary dinner had been nothing more than a momentary flare of temper. He truly believed I was back under his thumb, the same predictable Lauren who would always choose peace over justice. One evening, he came home later than usual, whistling a tune and looking particularly self-satisfied. He patted my shoulder as I stood at the kitchen island. "See? Lauren, I knew you would see sense," he said, his voice dripping with that familiar, nauseating patronization. "A little honesty goes a long way. You are finally starting to grow up. It makes things so much easier for both of us, doesn't it?" I gripped the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white, but I kept my face neutral. I suppose you are right. Daniel. Everything is much clearer now. Exactly, he said, heading toward his office. I might have to go to Atlanta next week for a few days. Big merger talk? You won't mind, will you? Not at all, I said, my voice steady. Take all the time you need. The moment his office door clicked shut, I pulled out my phone. I sent a single text to Megan. He is leaving for Atlanta on Tuesday. Do it. On Monday morning, while Daniel was at the office finalizing his plans for his trip with his secretary, I met Megan at the courthouse. I signed the papers for a legal separation. As the clerk stamped the documents, I felt a physical weight lift off my chest. In the eyes of the law, as of 10:15 this morning, Daniel Whitaker and I were no longer a single unit. The countdown for Aunt Sarah's trust had officially begun. I had 35 million reasons to stay calm, and as I watched the clock on the courthouse wall tick forward, I knew that for every minute Daniel spent feeling superior, he was actually losing a battle he didn't even know he was fighting. Daniel returned from his supposed Atlanta trip on Thursday evening, looking refreshed and wearing a new designer watch that certainly had not been purchased with his official salary. He tossed his leather briefcase onto the mahogany dining table and began regaling me with stories of high-powered meetings and steak dinners. I let him speak for 5 minutes, watching the way his hands moved with that practiced, corporate charisma. I waited until he reached for a glass of water before I slid the manila folder across the table. What is this? Lauren Moore research on the wetlands, he asked, his voice thick with a condescending chuckle. Open it. Daniel, I said. My voice was a flat line, devoid of the warmth he had spent 10 years extinguishing. He flipped the cover open. I watched his eyes scan the first page, the itemized list of his hotel stays in Charleston, the credit card statements for jewelry I never wore, and the printouts of his private emails to his secretary. The color drained from his face, replaced by a mottled, angry red. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. This is a massive invasion of my privacy, he stammered, his fingers trembling as he gripped the paper. You have been spying on me. Is this what you do with your time now? This is pathetic. Lauren, most of this is just business. You are blowing things out of proportion because you don't understand how the world works. I understand perfectly. I replied, I understand that you spent $6,000 on a diamond bracelet in October. I understand that Project Alpha was actually a 3-day weekend at a resort while I was told you were in board meetings. And I understand that you have been moving 10% of our joint savings into a hidden account for the last 4 months. Daniel slammed his hand onto the table, the glass of water rattling. The mask of the successful executive was beginning to crack. So what? So I had some fun. Do you honestly blame me? He stood up, towering over me in an attempt to intimidate. Look at yourself. Lauren, you are dull. You are obsessed with your little nonprofit projects and your boring data. You haven't been interesting in years. A man in my position needs someone who matches his ambition, someone with a bit of life in her, not someone who spends her weekends looking at maps of swamps. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I just looked at him with a sense of profound detachment. Is that the excuse you are going with? Daniel, that I am not interesting enough to merit basic respect. It is the truth, he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. You are lucky I stayed this long. You should be thanking me for maintaining the facade for the sake of your parents. But if you want to play this game, fine. We can talk about a divorce. But don't think for a second you are getting a cent of my bonuses or my shares in Silver Row. I have worked too hard for you to bleed me dry. I leaned back, a cold, sharp smile touching my lips. This was the moment the floor was going to disappear beneath him. I am not interested in your bonuses, Daniel. And as for the divorce, you are a little behind the curve. at 10:15 on Monday morning, while you were boarding your flight to Atlanta with your secretary. I filed for a legal separation in the Bay Ridge County Courthouse. The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel froze. He knew the law as well as I did. In North Carolina, the date of legal separation is a hard line in the sand. Anything earned or moved after that moment is no longer part of the shared marital estate. You did what? He whispered, his eyes wide and frantic. Monday. But we were just at dinner on Sunday. You said you needed time to think. I did think. I said, and then I acted. Since we are now legally separated, that private account you have been filling up is officially part of the marital assets to be split. But any debt you accrued in Atlanta this week is entirely your own. And those transfers you made on Tuesday morning, the court sees those as an attempt to defraud the estate. The panic finally took hold. He began to pace, his breathing coming in short, jagged gasps. He realized that his carefully constructed exit plan had been intercepted. He realized that the woman he thought was a predictable, sensitive victim had been 3 steps ahead of him the entire time. Lauren. Wait, we can talk about this, he said, his voice cracking. I was stressed. The job is a lot of pressure. I didn't mean those things I said at the dinner. You know I love you. Right. We have 10 years of history. You can't just throw it away because of a few mistakes. You didn't make mistakes. Daniel, you made choices. I said, standing up. I felt no satisfaction in his fear, only a deep sense of relief that the weight of him was finally being lifted. You told everyone that a real woman doesn't care if her husband parties with his secretary. It turns out you were right. I don't care anymore. I don't care about your excuses, your secret accounts, or your desperate need to feel important. But the house, the accounts. If we separate now, I lose the tax incentives on the Silver Row merger, he cried out. His arrogance completely shattered. You are ruining everything I walked toward the door, not even looking back at the man who had been my world for a decade. He was just a collection of bad habits and borrowed confidence. Our conversation is over. Daniel, from now on, you can speak to Megan Price. I have nothing left to say to you. I walked out of the room and up the stairs, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own lies. The countdown to the trust was nearing its end, and for the first time in my life, I was the one who was truly interesting. The collapse of Daniel's world did not happen with a single explosion, but rather through a series of cold, administrative strikes. 2 days after our confrontation, I received a call from a woman named Sarah Jenkins, the head of human resources at Silver Row Dynamics. My anonymous tip, backed by the digitized folder of expense reports and travel receipts, had triggered a forensic audit. They found that Daniel had billed the company over $15,000 in personal indulgences over the last 12 months, disguised as client development. By Friday afternoon, the news had leaked through the tight-knit professional circles of Bay Ridge. Daniel was officially suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct and ethics violations. In a town where reputation is the only currency that matters, his was suddenly worth nothing. The man who had bragged about being modern and energetic was now the subject of hushed conversations at every country club and coastal bistro in the county. I remained in the eye of the storm, perfectly still and utterly silent, while the local gossip mill churned with stories of the disastrous anniversary dinner and the disgraced media manager. I spent my mornings in Eleanor Whitaker's office. We moved with surgical precision to finalize the paperwork for the trust, because the legal separation was officially recorded before the final disbursement of the $35 million. The assets were locked behind a vault of sole ownership. Daniel had no legal claim to a single penny of Aunt Sarah's legacy. You have done everything right, Lauren, Eleanor said, sliding a final document toward me. He is out of the picture. Legally. He is a ghost to this estate. The social fallout hit Daniel even harder than the financial one. His parents. once so proud of their high-flying son, had seen the evidence. They had heard his drunken, cruel words at the dinner. His mother called me, her voice trembling with a shame that was almost painful to hear. "Lauren, honey, I am so sorry," she whispered over the phone. "We had no idea we didn't raise him to be this man. We told him he isn't welcome at our house until he makes this right, but I don't think he ever can. Can he?" "No, Margaret," I said softly. "He can't." Daniel's arrogance was replaced by a frantic, clawing desperation. He tried to call me 42 times in a single weekend. He sent long, rambling emails filled with apologies that felt like they were written by a stranger. When I blocked his number, he showed up at our house, the house that was now legally mine as part of the separation agreement. I watched him from the upstairs window as he stood on the driveway, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face pale. He banged on the front door, his voice echoing through the quiet neighborhood. "Lauren, just let me in for 5 minutes. Please. I am losing everything. They are going to fire me. Lauren, Silver Row they are taking my shares. You have to tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you authorized those expenses. Please. I have nowhere else to go. I didn't open the door. I didn't even go downstairs." I picked up the phone and called the security service we had utilized for years. "There is a man trespassing on my property," I said into the receiver. "Please send someone to remove him immediately." 10 minutes later, I watched as the private security patrol arrived. Daniel was hysterical, his voice cracking as he tried to explain his way out of the situation. "You don't understand," he screamed at the guards. "That is my wife. We have been married for 10 years. We just had our anniversary, Lauren. Please, don't do this to me. I was just joking about the secretary. It was just a joke." His voice broke on the last word, dissolving into a ragged, pathetic sob. I watched until they escorted him to his car and forced him to drive away. I felt no joy in seeing him crumble. I felt only a profound sense of exhaustion and the quiet satisfaction of a researcher who had finally reached the end of a long, difficult project. He had wanted a modern woman who didn't care about loyalty. He had finally found one who didn't care about him at all. I turned away from the window and went back to my desk. I had a nonprofit budget to finalize and $35 million to put to good use. The Whitaker era was over, and the Lauren era was just beginning. The transition from the life I knew to the life I deserved happened with the quiet efficiency of a rising tide. I sold the house in the suburbs, the one with the white trim and the hollow silences, and moved into a sun-drenched loft overlooking the Bay Ridge Harbor. It was smaller, but the air felt 100 times lighter. There were no ghosts of Daniel's arrogance lurking in the corners, and no lingering scent of his expensive bourbon in the curtains. I spent my first few weeks simply listening to the sound of the ocean, a sound that no longer felt like it was drowning me out. I funneled a significant portion of Aunt Sarah's legacy into the Harbor Insight Institute. I started with a direct investment of $5 million to launch the Coastal Resilience Initiative, a project Daniel had once called a time-consuming hobby. Now, I was not just a researcher. I was the primary benefactor. I sat at the head of the boardroom table, not as the quiet wife of a Silver Row manager, but as a woman whose vision was backed by $35 million of cold, hard independence. Lauren, the progress we have made in just 6 months is staggering. The Institute director said during our quarterly review, "We have secured 3 new protected zones and hired 10 additional field scientists. You have changed the trajectory of this entire organization." I looked at the data charts on the screen and felt a surge of confidence that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with purpose. "We are just getting started," I replied, my voice steady and resonant. "We are going to ensure this coastline is protected for the next 50 years. Outside of my professional world, I began to carefully curate my life. I reconnected with friends I had drifted away from during the years Daniel had isolated me with his subtle criticisms. I hosted small dinners in my loft, where the conversation was intellectually stimulating and the laughter was genuine. I no longer felt the need to scan the room for Daniel's approval or wait for his permission to speak. My friendship with Megan deepened, moving from a relationship of legal protection to one of mutual respect and shared joy. You look like a different person. Lauren, Megan said one evening as we sat on my balcony, watching the sunset paint the Atlantic in shades of violet and gold. I feel different. Megan, I said, leaning back into my chair. I spent so long trying to be the woman Daniel wanted that I forgot I was already someone worth knowing. I don't feel like I have to prove anything anymore. I just am. As my life expanded, Daniel's world continued to contract. The investigation at Silver Row Dynamics had been thorough and unforgiving. He was officially terminated for cause, a mark on his record that made him radioactive to every other firm in North Carolina. Without the high-status job and the expensive expense account, the energetic people he used to party with vanished like smoke. I heard through the Bay Ridge grapevine that he had moved into a cramped one-bedroom rental on the far edge of town, his designer suits now looking out of place in his new, diminished reality. He tried to approach me once, a few weeks ago, at a local grocery store. He looked older, the arrogance in his eyes replaced by a frantic, hollow desperation. He stood at the end of the aisle, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Lauren, please," he whispered, his voice cracking as he stepped toward me. I just wanted to say I am sorry. Everything I had, it is all gone. I have nothing left. Can we just talk for 5 minutes for old time's sake?" I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, not even a spark of the old hurt. He was a stranger to me, a ghost from a past life that I had long since outgrown. The distance between us was no longer measured in miles or legal documents. It was a permanent, psychological canyon that he could never cross. "There is nothing left to talk about, Daniel," I said, my voice calm and final. "I hope you find whatever it is you are looking for, but you won't find it here." I walked past him without looking back. I had spent 10 years being a lighthouse for a man who wanted to crash into the rocks. Now, I was finally sailing my own ship, and the horizon ahead was vast, clear, and entirely my own. The final hearing took place on a Tuesday morning at exactly 10 o'clock. The courtroom was a stark, wood-paneled room that felt like a vacuum, sucking the last 10 years of my life into a leather-bound file. Daniel sat 3 feet away from me, but he might as well have been on another planet. He was dressed in a suit that used to fit him perfectly, but now he looked like he was wearing someone else's clothes. His skin was sallow, and the arrogance that once defined him had been replaced by a heavy, slumped defeat. The judge flipped through the final decree of divorce with a rhythmic, mechanical sound. He stopped at a specific page, his spectacles sliding down his nose. "It is noted here in the deposition," the judge said, his voice echoing in the quiet chamber. "The respondent, Daniel Whitaker, publicly stated that, and I quote, 'Real women don't care if their men party with his female secretary.' Mr. Whitaker, is this an accurate reflection of your marital philosophy?" Daniel's throat moved as he swallowed hard. He looked at the floor, his face flushing with a deep, permanent shame. It was a joke, Your Honor. I was under a lot of stress. It was a joke that cost you your reputation and your marriage," the judge replied coldly. "Based on the evidence of financial misconduct and the clear breach of the marital contract, the court hereby finalizes the distribution of assets. Lauren Whitaker is confirmed as the sole and independent owner of the Sarah Bennett Trust, valued at $35,400,000. Mr. Whitaker, You have no claim, present or future, to these funds or any property acquired after the date of legal separation. The gavel hit the wooden block with a sound that felt like a closing door. It was over. 10 years of gaslighting, 10 years of feeling small, and 10 years of being the background music to someone else's ego had been settled in less than 20 minutes. I stood up and smoothed my coat. Daniel stood up too, trying to catch my eye. "Lauren, please," he whispered, his voice trembling so much he could barely get the words out. "I am leaving. I am moving back to my sister's place in Ohio. I just wanted to know if you will ever be able to forgive me." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see a villain. I didn't even see a husband. I saw a small man who had traded a lifetime of loyalty for a few nights of feeling powerful. "I don't hate you, Daniel," I said, my voice calm and devoid of any lingering heat. "But I don't think about you anymore. You are a part of my history, not my future." He stood there, frozen, as I walked out of the courtroom. Within 48 hours, he had packed his remaining belongings and left Bay Ridge in silence. No one came to say goodbye. The man who wanted to be the center of every room had left town as a footnote. That evening, I drove out to the edge of the coast where the sand meets the Atlantic. I stood on the pier, the wind whipping through my hair, carrying the salt air that I had grown to love. There was no loud celebration. I didn't feel like I had won a war. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. People often think revenge is about destruction. They think it is about watching someone burn or seeing them suffer. But as I watched the waves crash against the shore, I realized the truth. Real revenge isn't about the other person at all. It is about the moment you realize they no longer have the power to make you feel small. It is about the moment you look in the mirror and see a woman who can never be dismissed or disregarded again. I am Lauren Whitaker, and I am finally free. Thank you for listening to this story. Please comment where you are listening from to join the conversation and share your thoughts. Subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, like the video, and support us by hitting the hype button so more people can hear this story.